The first data source control we're going to talk about is the SQL data source, and it can do a lot with very little. It makes it very easy to query different types of databases, get that data, and then get it into and bound with controls in your website. Now you can also do updates, inserts, and deletes with it as well, so it's very flexible that way. So the SQL data source allows for a declarative type of data binding. So instead of having to write custom C# or VB code, we can actually go in and use the SQL data source within the ASPX page itself. Now it does have events, so it is possible you might have some code that you want to tie into, such as when an insert occurs or something like that. But out of the box, oftentimes you can just drag it onto the page, walk through a wizard, and then you're ready to go. You can get this going very quickly. Now it supports 4 different types of .NET providers out of the box. Now a .NET provider is just a set of classes that are able to hit a back-end database. So we have a SQL provider that's specific to SQL Server, OLEDB, which is more of a generic type. For instance, you could hit Access or DB2 databases. ODBC is really for anything out there. It's a more old school type of driver. And then finally you have support for Oracle as well. And so these 4 managed providers are supported, and although it's called the SQL data source, it's not just for SQL Server. Now, by default, when it gets its data, you can bind it and then do sorts and filters and all kinds of stuff. So it uses what's called a data set mode. And that's where it actually loads the records up into memory and then binds those. But you can switch it to also stream the data. Now, if you stream the data, paging and all that is not going to be available because it doesn't know how many records there are. It's a stream of data. Get one row at a time. But you can do that by changing the control's data source mode. So if you're doing a read-only operation where you just want to get the data into the page as fast as possible, but you don't need filtering and sorting and that type of stuff, then I would switch the data source mode to data reader. If on the other hand you want to do anything other than that, such as paging, sorting, filtering, go ahead and leave the default there. Now, as I just mentioned, it does support paging, filtering, sorting. It can do inserts, updates, and deletes, so what we call CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. And it even has built-in support for caching, which makes it very easy to not have to hit the database every time. If you have some data, and that data only changes, let's say once every 30 seconds, 60 seconds, or even longer, then you can tell the control that, hey, I want to cache this data so that every time the page loads during that 30-second period, it just pulls from memory. Doesn't have to touch the database. Really speeds up performance and enhances the scalability of your website. Now here's an example of using the SQL data source control. Now normally you're not going to be typing this in. Normally you'll use something like a data list, which just simply spits out a list of items, and then you'll bind that data list to a SQL data source. So you'll notice the magic glue here is this data source ID, which I mentioned earlier, is available on all of the items controls, the different controls that can support multiple rows. They have this data source ID. Notice the name here, SQL Customers. We'll come on down to our SQL data source. Now this is a server control, so notice the ID matches first off, SQL Customers. We have run at server. We have what is the connection string to talk to the database, and then what's the command we'd like to execute. So the connection string is actually using a connection strings expression. So we talked about data binding expressions, which are the %, which you see one up here, the eval. Well, the $$ are a different type of expression, and this one allows us to go into our web config file, go find the connection strings area, and then grab the connection string. And the wizard I'm going to show you in a moment, it actually puts all this in. You don't even have to type that piece. You can actually select what you'd like to hit all visually, and it'll create the connection string for you. It's pretty nice. Now the select command here is a special type. You'll notice in this case the command type is not just a text. It's not a SQL statement, a select field from table type of query. It's actually calling a store procedure. So for those of you that have to support store procedures, that absolutely is supported. And those of you that just want to do SQL statements, that's also supported in this particular control. The different data source controls, not just the SQL data source, but some of the others, they support different types of parameters. Now, it's one thing to have a store procedure or a select statement you execute that just returns all the records, but in reality, a lot of times we're doing some filtering. We're doing a where clause. Well, where do you get the data for that where clause? Does it come from the query string? Does it come from a drop-down list that might be on the page? Is it stored in a cookie? Is it posted back in a form? There's a lot of areas. So these are the different parameters that are supported. So you can get data from a control, from a cookie, from a form variable. Profiles relate to storing personalization data. So maybe you have your favorite report stored, and this will pull from that. Query string does what it says. It grabs data off of the query string, and then session data is a way to store data while a user is visiting a website, so every time they visit the next page, that data is available on the server. And so session parameter allows us to pull from a session. So an example of using some of these are shown here. We have a SQL data source control, but you'll notice we're using a control parameter to specify what type of parameter should be passed, in this case, to a stored procedure. So this stored procedure, you can see, is called get customers by country. So kind of goes without saying, we probably need to pass it a country. So we're going to get the country, in this case, from a control parameter. And what that means is all of our controls have IDs, typically, in our page. Well, we're going to say, hey, I want to go grab the control ID of DD countries, in this case, a drop-down list. And I would like to then go to the selected value of that particular control. And whatever value is there, I want to go ahead and assign it to the country parameter that would be passed in to this stored procedure. So this allows us to actually specify where the data is coming from, in this case the drop-down list. What's the data type of it? It's a string. What's the property of that control we want to get to? And then finally, what's the name of the parameter that this stored procedure needs? Now, if it was a SQL statement instead of a stored procedure here, you could also do parameterized queries, and it'll actually help you generate that visually as well. It's very nice and easy to work with. Now, you can also go in addition to grabbing from controls, oftentimes you might actually have a page that posts back but to a different page, and the data is up on the query string, up in the URL in the browser. Well, that's easy to do as well. We can simply, in our select parameters here, if we want to grab our country, we can say, hey, let's go up to the query string. I'd like to grab a query string field called country name. I'd like to map that as a string value to the country parameter, and then that gets passed in to our stored procedure or our select statement, either way. So this provides a really, really easy way to supply data dynamically when we're filtering our queries, and you'll see as I run the demos in the next section here that I really don't even have to type any of this either. I can do it visually, and it's very, very easy to work with. So let's take a look at how we can use the SQL data source in ASP.NET Webforms apps. To demonstrate using the SQL data source control, I've created an ASP.NET Webforms application project. So it's empty, just has a web.config at this point, which doesn't have a lot of code in it. So I'm going to go ahead and add in an ASP.NET web form, and we'll just call this default.aspx. Alright, now what I'd like to do is hit a database that has customers in it. So we're just going to use the ever popular Northwind database for this particular demo. We'll use some other databases coming up, but the Northwind database has customers, and customers are located in countries. It provides a very simple way to get started with this particular SQL data source control. So what I'd like to do is make it so a user can pick a country and then drill down and show the customers in that country, then even click a customer and then show the individual data for that one customer. So we're going to use three controls. We're going to use a drop-down list, a grid view, and something called a details view, which allows us to show one row of data. Alright, so to get started we need a database. Now I could hit a more industrial strength one that I might have out in the enterprise, but for this demo we're going to use SQL Express. So I'm going to right click on my project and say add ASP.NET folder, and you'll notice I can pick several different types of app folders here. So app global resources and local is for things like language strings, app data is for databases, app browsers is for browser configuration files. You can use this to detect different types of browsers. And then you can have a theme folder, which is for CSS, images, and themes in general. So we'll pick app data. Now on the desktop, I have a database folder here, dev databases, and I'm just going to select the Northwind file. and I'm going to go ahead and copy that into my app data. So we'll just right click and paste that in. So now I have a database that I can work with, and as I said, it has customers and countries for those customers. So the first thing I'm going to do is we need the user to come in and select from countries. So what I'm going to say is select a country. Alright, so we're going to drag on a drop-down list. Now you'll notice right as we drag that control on, I have this option to do choose data source. We're going to do that. So I'm going to say choose data source, and I'm going to say I want a new data source. Now it's going to pull up a wizard now, which I showed a little bit earlier in the module, to let me select different types of data source controls. So everything from access to XML files to entity framework type queries can be selected. Well, we're going to do a SQL database, and I'm going to go ahead and call this countries. Well, let's do SQL data source to keep it kind of obvious. And we'll hit OK. Now it's going to say, what database do you want to hit? So I can hit new connection if I'd like, and we could select everything from ODBC to Oracle to SQL Server. But normally, if I build, we can come in and select the Northwind database. Now because that doesn't show up, rather than canceling the wizard, we could say new connection. We'll say a SQL Server database file because it is an MDF file, and we'll say continue. Now that's going to let me browse to my file. So I'm going to run off to my desktop, find this project, and from this project we're going to go in and select this MDF file. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the default authentication. We can test the connection. Looks like it worked, and then we'll hit OK. Now what that's going to do is automatically make the connection string to hit the Northwind MDF file. So you notice I have my connection string here. It's hitting SQL Express, but you'll notice that there's something kind of unique in the connection string. It's actually pointing it to a data directory. Well, that happens to be the app data folder. And then I have this northwind.mdf. Alright, so I'm going to hit next, and now it's going to say, do I want to save that connection string into my web.config file? And I do. Now you could change the name, but we'll leave it. Now this is where it gets really fun. It's super easy. All you need to know is how to work with these different screens here, and they're very simple. So I want to select all the customers, but in the Northwind database there's actually not a customers table. It's not a super normalized database. So in the countries there is a country field though. So you'll notice it automatically, once I select the table, allows me to come in and then click on which field. So I can do it that way. You'll notice as I click these it writes my SQL for me. Very nice. Or I could come up and I could do a custom SQL statement or store procedure, and when we hit next we'd have to specify that. But for this demo we're going to select country. Now because country is duplicated across the customers, I only want to return the distinct countries. So I'm going to simply check that return only unique rows, and we're off and running. So I'll hit next, and now it's going to let me actually test the query without even running the web page. A really nice feature. And there's all my unique countries that I can now reference. So we'll hit finish. Alright, so now it's going to say, okay, you have a drop-down list. What do you want to show for the value of the behind-the-scenes value of the drop-down list, which is a HTML select, and for the actual text that the user sees? Well, in this case, I just want it to be the country name for both. I want the backing value to be country, and I want the actual value the user sees to be country. So we just hit OK. So now what it's done is it added a SQL data source, it bound it into my drop-down list, and then the last thing I'm going to do here is say I'd like to enable auto postback. Now this will add a little bit of JavaScript so that when the user of this page selects a country, it's automatically going to go and do a postback. So what we can do is actually come over to our properties and come into our properties for our grid or our drop-down list. And a really nice feature that we have is something called append data-bound items. I'm going to set that to true. Now what that's going to allow me to do is if I add into the source an actual list item. So I'm going to say ASP list item, And I'm going to go ahead and say that the value of this is nothing, but that the text is select a country. We'll do a shortcut close tag there. Now what this will do is automatically add select a country at the very top, and because we did this append databound items and set that to true, all the countries from the database are going to be loaded after this particular item. Really nice. Didn't even have to write any code to do that as far as C# or VB. Now let's take a look while we're here at what we have so far. So we have a drop-down list and we have that append databound items, but the key is this guy. We have a DataSource ID, and that DataSource ID points down to country's SQL data source, which is there. We also have an expression. Now this expression will go into web config, go into the connection strings, and grab that connection string. Now that's been added for us by the wizard. You'll see there's my connection strings, there's my connection string name, that's my key, and then there's the connection string it generated using the wizard. Very nice, very easy to work with. So this connection string will automatically pull it out using this expression right here. Here is my command to execute. Now this is a text command, so it's a select statement obviously. Okay, so we're kind of on the right track. Now if we run this as is, we should basically get some countries, and it's not going to do much from there, but we can select them and then we'll keep going here. So there's my select a country, there's my countries, and it now posts back. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is under the SQL data source, I want a grid view control. So we're going to come down into the data section and drag on a grid view. Now the grid view, I'm going to auto format, give it a little bit of coloration here. And I also want a data source for this one. I want to select all the customers. So I'm going to do the same process. I don't want the country's SQL data source, I want a new one. We're going to say SQL database. We can call this customers SQL data source. Hit OK, and we can pick the same connection string we already have. And now it's pretty easy. We can come down and say, I want to select customers. Let's say I'd like to maybe select the ID and the first couple fields here. Notice it generates all the SQL. But now I want a where clause. I want to where the country equals the value from that drop-down list. So we're going to select the where button here. And I'm going to say where, here's all the fields from my table, the country equals, now the source is going to be a control. It's going to be that drop-down list. Now this is a good example of why you should give good names to your controls. Since I didn't give an explicit name to it, it's probably going to be drop-down list 1. And you'll see it right there. So there's my grid, there's my drop-down. So we'll select it. And if there's no value selected, I'm going to pass null to the query. So what this is now doing is it's going to do a where country equals the value from drop-down list 1 selected value. So drop-down list 1 selected value will automatically get substituted in for this parameter. So we're going to add that and hit OK. You can see there's my query now. Now from here, what I'm going to do is hit next and test it. It's going to make me supply a country, so we'll say USA in this particular example. Now we'll go ahead and hit OK to test it out. This will query the database, and we should get back all the customers and those fields we selected from the customers table there. So really nice, because I didn't have to write any custom connection, command, issue the command to the database. It's going to do this for me. And we'll hit finish there. Alright, so now we have a grid view, and I can even go in and enable paging. I can enable sorting, and even enable selecting a specific customer. And I'm going to want that for this demo because I'd like to select a customer and then below this show all the details for that customer. So the final thing we're going to do in this demo is I'm going to drag on another data control called a details view. Now the details view, kind of like its name implies, allows us to basically show one row of data. So I'm going to auto format it. Just pick something that has a little bit of color to it. Choose a data source again. So I don't want any of those. This time I want to select the customer where the customer ID comes from, whatever they clicked on up here in the grid. So we'll hit new data source again, and you kind of get the pattern here. So we'll say customer SQL data source. We'll pick the same connection string, and we do want the customer's table, and we're going to say I want everything. Now, if you don't like doing a star, you can certainly check all these. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to select the default here. And again, we want a where clause. Now this time, we want to select the customer ID from the grid. So I'm going to say where customer ID equals, and the source will be a control again, which will be the grid view selected value. Very similar to what we did with the dropdown. And if by chance there wasn't one, and this got invoked, we want null. We don't want to show it. So you can see again, it's going to filter where customer ID equals a parameter. That parameter value is going to come from the grid, so we'll add that. Now, like before, I can hit next and I can test. Now, one other interesting thing we can do here, though, is if I hit advanced, I can even have the SQL data source for this details view generate insert, update, and delete statements. So I'm going to go ahead and do that in this case, and we'll instantly get update capability without having to write any code on our part. So let me hit next here and we can test it. So the only customer ID I know off the top of my head is ALFKI. That's the first customer, so we'll hit OK. Goes out to the database. There we go. We get back that record, and we can hit finish. Now from here, the details view also allows us to do things like, do we want to enable an insert capability, editing, and deleting? So we'll go ahead and say, yeah, we'd like all that stuff in this case. So now that's going to show everything, including the image. I can actually come in, though, and we can even edit the fields that are displayed here. So you'll notice the selected fields have everything, but I'm going to get rid of the image, let's say. Let's say I don't want to show that because that's just a JPEG path name. It's not the actual real image. And since I don't have that image, we don't want to show it, so we'll go ahead and just delete that and hit OK. Now you'll notice it takes that out of our details view. Now likewise, up on the grid view, I can edit the columns. So we could come in and add columns from our selection, our bound fields, and delete columns and do all that fun stuff as well. Alright, so that's it. Now if we go look back at the source, you're going to see that each of these controls now has a SQL data source. So there's the one for the drop-down list. There's the grid code. There's the one for the grid, customer SQL data source. They're all using the expression to get the connection string. And then finally, here's the one for the details view. Now notice this one has quite a bit more, I should say, going on. We have delete parameters, insert parameters, select, and even update parameters. And this is what it's doing, is it's reading from the text boxes that are in this details view once it's rendered. And it's going to render that to the screen, and then once we hit a button, it'll put this back in the database using these different commands that you see. Alright, so let's go ahead and see what we get just by kind of clicking around in the wizard there. Alright, so we'll come in, we'll select a country, we'll say Finland. Now it just pulled all the customers from there. I can actually come in and sort these if I'd like. You'll see that works. Very nice. I can select a customer. We're now in the details view. I'll hit edit, and let's just put a Wilman Kayla 2 just to see if it works, and we'll hit update. Now it looks like it did, but let's go ahead and remember I did Finland. We'll come back, select Finland again, and select the appropriate one, which was this one, and you can see it did work. We have this Wilman Kayla 2. We'll hit edit, and we'll take that off. So I could also delete. I can do a new record if I'd like. All that type of stuff is built in for me. So it's very, very flexible, and you can see how easy it was to do with the SQL data source. So that's an example of how we can use the SQL data source control and bind it to different types of controls, such as the drop-down list, the grid view, and the details view control.